Okay, wonderful. So the STEPS Centre, or the organisers of the conference in their wisdom, invited me and John Thompson to organise a session about agri-food, and we have the challenge of somehow putting a sort of a full stop or some kind of a parenthesis around 15 years of STEPS work in this domain. Clearly an impossible task. So instead of that, what we're doing is something a bit more fun, a bit more interesting, and maybe a bit more forward-looking. And we thought it would be interesting to engage with the work of some STEPS Centre colleagues who have started to explore the implications of transformations and different governance approaches to transformation, those which are more informed by an ethic of care, in contrast to those that are more informed by an aspiration or a dream of control. And we thought it would be interesting to think about this in relation to resilience, and especially in relation to some current challenges. Of course, we could mention COVID. Here in the UK, we can mention Brexit, where there have been some visible stresses and strains to our food system because of putting up trade barriers with the rest of the EU. And I'm sure we could mention other examples from around the world. So we thought it would be interesting to explore the implications of these caring versus controlling approaches to the governance of transitions or transformations. And I don't know how many of you have had a chance to have a look at the preparatory materials that we shared in advance. There's a paper, I will put the link in the chat, or perhaps John could do that, which is by 4 of our colleagues from the STEPS Centre, which is about these caring, controlling approaches and giving examples from food systems. And we also set up a mural online with the opportunity to go in there and see if you could come up with some real or hypothetical examples of case studies that you could try to position in relation to 2 axes, of one of resilience, high versus low resilience, and the other of an axis of caring versus controlling approaches. And if I can, I'm going to quickly share the screen to show you what that looks like. Bear with me a moment, because of course the window that I want is not showing right now. Sorry, bear with me. Okay, I found it. Okay, so you should see, this is what the mural looks like if you go there. We'll put the address in the window, and as you can see that there's been some engagement with the mural wall before we actually started. So this has been a way to get the conversation flowing, because we don't have very much time and I'm already talking too much. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our 3 panelists who are going to help us get this conversation started. And I'll stop sharing my screen and introduce them one by one. So we have 3 very kind panelists who've joined us today. Divya Sharma, who is a lecturer in sustainable development at the Science Policy Research Unit at Sprue University of Sussex, co-director of the University of Sussex Sustainable Development Masters, which is an online distance learning program. Her work focuses on post-colonial rural transformations, mapping changing landscapes of work and the politics of sustainability in food systems. Nadia Sitas is a senior researcher in the Centre for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. She's a sustainability scientist working within the science policy interface on issues related to social ecological resilience, with a specific focus on equity and gender. And Per Olsson is an associate professor at the Stockholm Resilience Centre in Sweden. He leads the centre's work on transformations for sustainability. His current research focuses on agency and system entrepreneurship, social ecological innovations, transformations to sustainability, and how to reverse current trends of crossing critical thresholds and tipping points in the Earth system. So without further ado, we've asked each of these 3 panelists to get us started with a very brief kind of provocation to get the conversation going. And let's go first of all, if I may, to Nadia.
Thanks very much, Dominic. And yeah, thanks for having me and inviting me to be part of these conversations. I was also extremely sad to hear that the STEPS Centre was transitioning into something new. I attended the STEPS Summer School in 2017 and really benefited from a lot of the work, and have continued to tap into the knowledge generated by that centre. and very happily now involved in a project with some researchers from IDS and the STEP Centre as well. So very excited and happy to be here. What I'm going to be reflecting on is two pieces of work with quite different kind of governance approaches in terms of where they sit with that between the care and control axes. But lots of similarities in terms of they both kind of emerging or functioning or trying to function or acting within the context of a failed or some kind of failing state, with the kind of absence of formal governance structures. And definitely for some of them that have allowed kind of the emergence of networks of care, but also another system that has allowed processes to be quite captured. So they also both operate within the context of legacies, and legacies came out quite strongly in the two pieces of work that I'll mention. And that's, one is the legacy of apartheid in South Africa. So how that's played out across rural and urban landscapes, and especially within the food system, how that's shaped many flows of food, both kind of locally, but also cross scales, even tapping into international value chains. But also in terms of the spatial kind of segregation and coordinated exclusion of people from certain processes. And we can see that manifesting in many systems today. But also in terms of the legacy of farmers. So if you speak to a lot of farmers involved in food systems, they'll talk about being third or fourth generation farmers, and how trying to kind of nudge or tinker or shift those systems is incredibly hard when you've got these identities that are coupled to what they know how to do, and quite resilient systems in terms of how they kind of act as farmers. So the one example is the response is kind of a crisis response, and it was a response to the lockdown measures with COVID in South Africa. And it was a kind of a spontaneous emergence of food solidarity networks and initiatives to keep flowing, to keep food flowing to communities when they weren't able to either access job opportunities, or in some instances in South Africa, when we really weren't able to leave our homes for quite a significant period of time. And this was all within the context of a state that was very slow or unable to respond to provide support to people. So how do you work within those contexts? And it was really interesting to see these initiatives that emerged that were based on care and reciprocity, and really working around food solidarity. And this is kind of in contrast with the other example, which is around these high export and commercial horticultural value chains around fruit. And this is a GCRF project that we're working on that's looking at the impacts of droughts in these value chains in Kenya and South Africa. And there are some of the response measures to, initially to drought, but also to other shocks in the system have been very much framed around these governance mechanisms of controlling. And how, just what's emerged from the work that we've been doing in South Africa is that it's actually a captured system. And so how these controlling governance structures can be captured, and it's kind of elite capture, and so certain systems and certain practices are extremely resilient, and how they're able to access markets, resources, capitals to keep their processes flowing. And so kind of, it was really hard to, when we were asked to put things on the mural board in terms of, thinking about how this plays out in terms of resilience, and how certain actors were resilient in the face of shocks, especially because what we realized, and through this work is, especially within the horticultural value chains, some of the actions and responses to these shocks have made certain actors extremely resilient, but they've been at the expense of other actor groups. And so how do you kind of look at this interplay between, certain resilience undermining other people's resilience? And then that's kind of at an individual level or at a farm level, but how do you think about that in terms of a system as well? And so certain actor groups, how their actions play out across the system. So just some reflections on how is it that you can start mobilizing more of an ethic of care in these highly captured systems. And then when you're thinking about these spontaneous networks of care that have emerged in response to a crisis, how do you make them stick? So how do you start thinking about some other mechanisms and more formal governance that you can start implementing in order for those amazing networks that have come out of an emergency, a kind of a feeling of emergency? How do you foster those and keep them going, and kind of institutionalize and support some of those networks that are often kind of based on voluntary work. So those type of processes. And I think it's got me thinking around crises and how, especially in the context where I work, it's not just one crisis that hits, but it's kind of these coalescing crises. And the relationship between a crisis and kind of violence, and especially with our very violent history in South Africa. And so these notions of the kind of the colliding between slow and fast violence, and the difficulty in actually thinking about how that plays out when you want to try and change a system, and where you even can locate where this violence kind of operates, and the powerful forces that entrench these systems that are quite resilient. And so this is all kind of framed within the thinking of how do we create new pathways. And I think that was really useful, in reading a lot of the work that's coming from the STEP Center, which is around pathways being plural. Especially in my previous thinking, which was much more around, we can engineer this one future that we think is going to be wonderful and equitable, but really thinking more from a kind of a plurality of worldviews and a plurality of ways. And really thinking about how you can open up these spaces, especially within systems that are extremely trapped and seem to be quite trapped. And what is the role of different actors within that process, and thinking about resilience capacities and how you may build those, both in terms of anticipating, but also coping and adapting to certain changes and hopefully transforming as well. So I think I'll leave it there. A few more things to say, but I think we're also being given an opportunity to speak at the end. So I'll hold my comments for that. But thanks very much for this opportunity.
Nadia, many thanks for really opening it up. And what I really appreciate is that you've exposed the fact that actually it turns out to be rather difficult to do what we ask people to do on the mural, which is to position these cases on even just one of the axes, let alone both of them at the same time, which is a really interesting observation. So yeah, it's good to experience that. So our next panelist to provoke the discussion is Per Olsson. Over to you, Per.
Thank you, Dominic. And I also want to thank, big thanks to STEP Center and for all the good years we have had together, and that has to continue now, sort of more in other forms. But it's really heartwarming when we have the plenary and just see everyone. It's a lot about, as Melissa said, about friendship. So it's so nice to see everyone again. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of zooming out a bit and talk a little bit more about the framing of this session and some comments on that. And the first one is that I really like the focus on crisis, that put crisis at the center of the conversation here, because in transformation, understanding transformation dynamics, we need to understand the role of crisis and disturbance. And I think that for me, then it's coming from resilience thinking and resilience research, which has about 50 years of studying the role of crisis in systems dynamic, together then with STEPs explore these dynamics in the context of transformation. And when I talk about transformation, I also think that it's important to make a distinction about and be specific what transformation is. And from resilience point of view, we talk about the different responses to crisis. So it can be coping responses, basically sort of survival and keeping your nose above the surface. An adaptation response, which is dealing with the disturbance and changes, but continue to on a certain trajectory. But then transformation then is the ability to change trajectory when you're on unsustainable and unjust trajectories. So I think that distinction is really important to keep in mind, to think about the mural and what's in there, and thinking about the responses and what we see now, and thinking about what kind of responses do we see, and then be more specific about how it's linked to transformation. Because I think that transformation is becoming a more and more popular word, and which I really also think is super, and it's super that it's the focus of this this discussion. But the risk right now that when transformation as a word becomes more and more popular is that it just replaces the word change. So I think it's really important that we are, you know, clear about or provide some conceptual clarity and how, you know, about what type of change we're talking about and how it's different maybe from mitigation and just coping, but also adaptation. So I think in that, I think also that another thing that I think is really important is to look at transformation capacities and thinking about the capacities that we need throughout a transformation process. And I think that's why it's sort of challenging to put things on this mural, because I think that depending on what phase you are in a transformation, you might need a bit more controlling, and sometimes you need a bit more caring. And then, so it's about knowing what to do, what, when. So that's to me is understanding transformation or transformative capacities, and it's about understanding transformative capacity in specific phases of transformation, but also how you shift capacities when it's needed. So I think that that's a big challenge right now, is to, I think, for example, after a crisis, and there might be formative moments after the COVID crisis, etc., we're doing stuff that is more sort of preparation phase capacities, you know, preparing the system for change, or pre-development, as it's called in the transition management theory. So it's really about this sort of abilities to shift these capacities when it's needed. So I think that care and the care and controlling and conviviality is really useful to explore that dynamics. And so just to also just finish on this, that capacity also has to do with the fact that transformation is both a process of breakdown and a build-up, and many theories point to this and explore this. And from a resilience point of view, then it's about breaking resilience of the systems that are blocking things and not working and are toxic or are not delivering on the things that we think is important. So there, I also see that the pathway approach has been fundamentally important, and exploring both the path dependence and sort of that bad resilience, but also the transformative pathways and thinking about plurality, etc. So I'm looking forward to the discussions here, and thanks for inviting me and letting me talk.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much, Per. And I really like the way you've started to kind of trouble some of these categories, these labels about resilience and caring versus controlling versus conviviality, which I think is exactly what we wanted to stimulate in this session. So let me go then to our third panelist, our third and final panelist, Divya Sharma. Divya, are you there?
Thanks, Dominic and John, for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here, and I think I'm going to continue what was already been said and focus my comments largely on kind of problematizing the care versus control dichotomy, particularly by kind of thinking about the politics of care and what is it that we consider to be caring transformations or care in the domain of agri-food practices. And I think broadly, from looking at the mural, but also more generally, I think we can sort of think about it in three ways. I think there's practices and protests that are actively sort of challenging the consequences of control-driven policies in the industrial food system, that are actively sort of resisting or refusing those policies. Then there are sort of adaptation and coping mechanisms that people, whether at an individual level or collectively, are sort of doing to kind of cope with the consequences of control-driven industrial food systems. And then thirdly, I think the projects or community-led initiatives that actively represent themselves as kind of engaging in the construction of caring relations or creating alternative food systems or thinking about agroecology in different ways. And I'm going to sort of quickly maybe try and give 2 examples to sort of highlight some of the tensions. One comes from the STEP Center postdoc project that I was actually involved in with colleagues at SPRU as well as in India at the Madras Institute of Development Studies, where we were kind of talking to farmers, smallholding farmers, and assembling oral histories of the Green Revolution, which I think in broadly we thought of as a control-driven project for increasing food productivity in India, running since the 1960s. But what was happening in this one village in Tamil Nadu was that smallholders were kind of facing both economic and ecological crises, and with depleting water tables, etc., the cropping system was in a bit of a flux. And it's within that context that women in particular from smallholding households, small landowning households, started organizing to basically revive reciprocal labor exchange practices, which used to exist. Particularly to deal with the issue of, cash shortages in their households, or trying to kind of address that shortage, but also sort of they were investing most of the cash incomes they were earning in other things like education of their children, etc. So on the one hand, that kind of was a form of a coping mechanism that we can think of as a caring, reciprocal sort of labor exchange. But if we sort of contextualize that in the broader context of that village, but also the longer history of the region, it was basically undercutting the struggles of Dalit landless women workers who had bargained for certain, a certain level of wages, and they were sort of being excluded from employment, and they had to go elsewhere to seek employment in neighboring villages, etc. And that was a different sort of history of struggle that was in a way kind of reflecting different interests and needs and understandings of what care might look like within that context. And the second kind of example I wanted to sort of talk about was of an agroecology movement in northern India and Punjab, where which actively presents itself as working towards a caring transformation of the food system within that what they think of as a degraded ecology, again, as a consequence of the Green Revolution. But in this case, there are different visions of what agroecology should look like. A more purist vision where, there's sort of hopes for natural farming and mixed cropping systems and moving away from agrochemicals completely. But that vision is sort of impossible to realize in the short run for a lot of landless workers as well as smallholding farmers who want to engage more proactively with state-driven sort of incentives and mechanisms, etc., rather than a kind of prefigurative politics of changing the ecology and community practices. So again, there are those kinds of contesting visions of what agroecology should look like or what the pathway is to get there. And I think that kind of also helps us to maybe think about what are the boundaries that agroecology movements or other food movements are drawing in order to determine their own directionality and what elements of control and care kind of play out within that politics. So I'll just end there by also sort of maybe saying that I think there's two issues. One is, how do we examine agri-food practices through the lens of care, recognizing relationality and interdependence? But the second one is a slightly different issue, which is about what is it that we are categorizing as representing caring transformations. So I think I'll end there for now. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much, Divya, and thank you very much to all three of our panelists. And also I can see that a lot of people have been looking at the mural. It's great when you see lots of cursors going across the screen. It shows that people are engaging with that. So all participants in this session are now invited to post your questions in the chat box. We will include as many as we can. According to the timer I can see on my screen, we have about 22 minutes left. But I have to say, I've also seen a message saying that we're going to be kicked out at 25 past, which implies slightly less time, and I'm sorry about the uncertainty. I just don't really know. But we are going to turn over to the panelists at the end for a final word. So we probably have, let's say, 10 minutes or so for comments, questions, people who want to expand on the theme. And while we're waiting for some questions to appear in the chat box, I'm going to invite John Thompson to jump in case there's any observations that he has at this point.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you to our speakers and all the participants. It's a great to be here with you, even though this is a very brief opportunity to come together. It is, I think, a reflection on the sorts of issues that the STEP Center has been addressing around what we've called the food and agriculture domain for the last 15 years. And as Dominic and I were reflecting on what we hope to cover in this, the notion of crisis, as was mentioned, came front and center because, as was described in the plenary and in our opening presenters' talks, we're facing the crisis of the moment with COVID, but within the food system, we've encountered a number of these crises at different scales over the course of the STEP Center's activities, and will continue to do so in future. But some of the points that our presenters have touched on, we've tried to capture some of those in the mural here. I think a key point was about the fact that it's not a straightforward exercise of just moving from a controlling situation to one of care. That it's a combination of the two that's required at these different scales when we're talking about responding to crisis, of seeing the crisis as an opportunity perhaps to break out of a particular path dependence or lock in of the dominant food system that may be inequitable and unsustainable. And at the same time, identify opportunities for new pathways towards more socially just and sustainable food futures. And we heard about different forms of response, the coping, the adaptive, the transformative. And even within the transformative, the idea of achieving of moving towards a trajectory of change isn't necessarily going to lead to the sorts of outcomes that we're seeking, which brings us to the point that Divya was making about the politics of care and control, about the politics of transformation, being one that requires us to think about issues of practice and understanding of the politics of knowledge around that, about adaptation and coping, but also questions of constructing or creating new pathways to food futures. And the question then is, who benefits from those new pathways, who's able to engage, who's able to participate, and who might be excluded. And then we have the issue of scale, of at what level are we talking about these transformations taking place? Is it at a community level? Is it a national level, particular value chain, shall we say, where we're looking at transformation? In all of these, we're recognizing that we're bumping up against different interests, different actors, which brings us to, again, the politics of knowledge, the politics of of particular interests that may benefit from the status quo, from that concurrent system. And the question is, how do we break out and move beyond? And that's what we're hoping to touch on in this remaining session, this remaining part of the session, to think about that broadening out and opening up, as we've talked about in steps for many years, of considering those alternative pathways, how we make them robust, resilient, viable for large numbers of people, those alternatives that Divya was pointing to, that can be constructed or reinforced for the benefit of large.
Oh, John, your sound just disappeared, but I think we got the end of your points. Thank you very much for throwing those in. So we have had some contributions to the chat box. Thank you very much to everybody who's posted there. Anik Habink says, in relation to the COVID crisis, we've seen lots of adaptive practices to maintain resilience of the current food system, more towards BAU, perhaps. Assuming you mean business as usual, Anik, and what does this mean for the long-term transformative change that we need, envision, or desire? Anik, if you could open your microphone and just briefly expand on this, maybe by mentioning the examples of these adaptive practices to maintain resilience that you've observed in your own experience.
Yes, thanks, Dominic, and thanks to the speakers for sharing their perspectives. And I think this has been something that we've been reflecting on at Drift, is really what is the impact of COVID on the pathways to food system transformation. And while I think we've all hoped that COVID would be a window for opportunity for transformation, I think we've seen a lot of adaptive or coping practices to kind of keep what we currently have in place, and perhaps even kind of uphold actors that we would like to phase out towards the future. I think a lot of supermarkets, at least in Europe, have really gained dominance. So we're kind of reflecting. So the question is basically, what do you think this has done for kind of innovation, perhaps more bottom-up innovation, that didn't get a chance to emerge or accelerate as we would have liked to see, and have we gone back a few steps in kind of our transformation to food
very good question. Very good question. Thank you very much, Anik, and I will ask the panelists to come back on that particular question. Also on the next one, which was posted by Jose Alcaraz, which do you see as 3 crucial priorities for agri-food to address the planetary boundaries? I'll leave that with the panelists to come back on. Then I would like to call, if I may, briefly on Molly Anderson, who says, I haven't read the paper yet, and perhaps this is explained there, but how do you show different types of care or conviviality to indicate whether there is more or less of it in certain interventions? And I think it would be helpful to just briefly take this point, because I think what the mural exercise really demonstrates is that you have got to be really clear about what exactly you mean by a caring approach, a convivial approach, a controlling approach. Otherwise, it becomes rather difficult to make any headway with this kind of sort of classification system. So, Molly, if you're there, have I captured your point accurately? And maybe you want to very briefly expand on it?
Well, you did, Dominic, and this is a really interesting exercise, but the next point that I made is related a little bit, in that I'm having trouble categorizing practices because I really don't see resilience as a positive trait. It's just the dominant system is incredibly resilient, and that's not what we want. What we really want is the extent to which specific practices that embody care and conviviality are feeding into a transformation, but it's almost as if we need a spectrum of what those practices are, so that we could be comparing different transformative practices. Does that make sense?
That makes great sense, Molly. Thank you very much. I've just received a message from Nathan saying that, in fact, we only have about 4 minutes left, I'm afraid. So I'm really sorry that we have to sort of truncate this discussion, but we did promise the panelists just a very brief comeback, and they've got a couple of questions to answer. So let's go in the same order as we started with. Nadia, as briefly as you can, please.
This is really hard because I wanted to answer a lot of the questions, but I also wanted to, say some other things. I think it's also just on the resilience question. It's like, do you see it as an outcome, or is it the capacities to navigate change? And I think I probably see it more as understanding those capacities, and the outcomes are what's negotiated. Is it equitable? Is it a healthy food system? Those type of things. And definitely for me, which kind of answers that those three crucial priorities are maybe thinking about more kind of how do we embody, or how do we nurture or mobilize kind of transgressive care. So it's, explicitly challenging those aspects of society that have become normalized, but which require challenging to enable the changes that we desire to see. And that's, so it's connecting, it's really working around localizing food systems. And I think what we saw from our example in the food solidarity support is new examples of how food systems could be reconfigured, but you almost need the same amount of support that is keeping those dominant systems to be quite resilient in supporting these new systems that are different, because we've all slipped back as the crisis goes. We've slipped back to ordering food, through the online apps, through maybe supporting some of the bigger providers that can, give us convenience. So it's how do you mobilize those types of supports, and then mobilize in a more relational way to try and undermine some of those big forces, but really thinking about it in terms of like a radical act and not necessarily just a kind of more of a nurturing way.
That's great, Nadia. Thank you very much. Over to you, Per.
Yeah, I'm going to try to sort of respond to all the questions and say, like, the planetary boundaries aspect is, I think the food system, there's a lot to talk about. Food will fix it, which means that fixing the planetary boundaries, but also the social floor that Kate Rayworth talks about. So the three things that we talk a lot about is health, human health, biodiversity, and climate change. I like also the practices, and as I said how you categorize the practices. We categorize them by phases of transformation. So practices that are related to preparing the system for change, practices that are related to transitioning and navigating the transition, and also practices for consolidation and stabilization of the new system. So that's how we categorize practices. Syriac, is that right? Is that pronounced right? I love your question. Also, how do we imagine? I just want to mention, I think I think that radical imagination among many of the indigenous groups that we work with is really, really interesting. I think that's where I think the imagination and the future is, or thinking about the future is the most sort of edgy conversations I have is in that, and also African futures that or African futurism is really interesting us also from that perspective. We have Laura Pereira, who's in this meeting in another session, is working a lot on that. So that's it for me, I think.
Brilliant, Per, thank you. So we really are going to be kicked out very shortly. So in fact, 60 seconds. Divya, it's over to you for 30 seconds, please.
I think I'm just going to make a very quick but obvious point that for me, I think thinking through caring and convivial practices does mean actually paying attention to context and specific histories and emplaced and embodied practices, and that kind of is what separates them from control-driven, top-down, standardized solutions that are often proposed by people who don't have stakes in particular places. So yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say.
Brilliant, Divya. In the last 13 seconds, I will say thank you very much to all of the panelists and all of the participants. We'll leave the mural wall open for a little while longer, and let's treat this as an ongoing conversation.